The auctioneer's gavel froze mid-air as 5-year-old Benjamin Hawthorne coughed up blood onto his mother's worn calico dress. Clara May Hawthorne's arms tightened around her dying son, her green eyes blazing with fierce desperation as the crowd of Cedar Ridge townspeople stepped back in horror. This wasn't a livestock auction, it was human trafficking disguised as debt collection. Mrs. Henderson fainted into her husband's arms, her basket of apples scattering across the dusty town square. Children began crying as their mothers pulled them away from the makeshift platform. The metallic scent of blood mixed with summer heat and fear-soaked sweat. Clara remembered when these same people had welcomed her as the new schoolmarm just 2 years ago before her husband died, before the mysterious illness, before they turned their backs on her family. The banker's voice cracked as he called for opening bids. $50 for the pair, woman and child together. "Dear God," whispered old Martha Rose O'Sullivan, crossing herself. "What kind of monsters have we become? Who would buy a dying child and his desperate mother? And how much time did little Benny have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Clara May Hawthorne had arrived in Cedar Ridge with hope in her heart and teaching certificates in her carpet bag. The mountain town of 2,000 souls had welcomed the educated Boston woman with open arms, desperate for someone to school their children beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Her husband Thomas, a gentleman with calloused hands and dreams of striking silver, had found work in the mines while Clara transformed the one-room schoolhouse into a place of learning and laughter. Those golden autumn days seemed like another lifetime now. Thomas would return each evening with dirt under his fingernails and stories of the underground world, while Clara prepared lessons by lamplight and little Benny played with wooden horses on the cabin floor. They were building something beautiful, a life, a family, a future in this wild Colorado territory where the mountains touched the sky and anything seemed possible. Everything changed on that bitter February morning when the mine foreman knocked on their door. Thomas Hawthorne, they said, had been crushed in a cave-in while exploring a new shaft. Clara's world collapsed faster than the tunnel that claimed her husband's life, leaving her with a 5-year-old son, mounting debts, and whispers that followed her through the streets like autumn leaves. The grief nearly broke her, but Clara was made of sterner stuff than the townspeople realized. She threw herself into teaching, accepting charity positions, tutoring struggling students, taking in laundry, doing whatever honest work she could find. For months, she managed to keep their small cabin and put food on the table, though the pantry grew emptier and the creditors grew bolder. Then Benny fell ill in late spring, and Clara's careful house of cards came tumbling down. It started with a persistent cough that wouldn't respond to honey and herbs. Within days, the boy was burning with fever, and by the second week he was coughing up blood that stained Clara's nightgowns crimson. Doc Ezra Whitman, a gray-bearded man who'd delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge, examined the child with troubled eyes and spoke in hushed tones about diphtheria, that dreaded word that struck terror into every parent's heart. The town's reaction was swift and merciless. Families who had invited Clara for Sunday dinner now crossed the street to avoid her. The general store refused her credit, and parents pulled their children from her lessons. Fear spread faster than wildfire through cedar-shaded streets, fueled by whispers of contagion and divine judgment. Reverend Josiah Grimm, a severe man whose own loss had twisted his faith into something sharp and unforgiving, declared from his pulpit that sickness was God's punishment for hidden sins. Within 3 weeks, Clara found herself completely isolated, watching her son waste away while the community that had once embraced them turned their backs in terror. The final blow came when Judge Thaddeus Blackstone arrived with legal papers, claiming Thomas had left substantial debts to unnamed creditors, debts that Clara had never heard of, secured against property she didn't know they owned. With Benny too sick to travel and winter approaching, she had nowhere to run and no one to turn to. The crisis began on a sweltering Monday morning when Benny collapsed during morning prayers at the schoolhouse. Clara had been teaching the alphabet to a group of 6-year-olds when her son, who had been playing quietly in the corner with his wooden blocks, suddenly pitched forward onto the pine floor. The sickening thud of his small body hitting the planks was followed by screams from the other children as they saw the bright red blood spreading beneath his face. "Get away from him!" shouted Mrs. Henderson, snatching her daughter back as if Benny were a rabid animal. "Don't let the children near that cursed boy." The panic spread through the room like spilled lamp oil meeting flame. Parents who had come to collect their children pressed against the walls, covering their mouths with handkerchiefs and shawls, their eyes wide with terror above the makeshift masks. Clara dropped to her knees beside her son, cradling his burning head in her lap as he struggled to breathe through the blood filling his throat. His fever had spiked so high that his small body felt like a coal from the forge, and his usually bright blue eyes were glassy and unfocused. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "it hurts to swallow." The sight of her precious boy, so weak and frightened, broke something fundamental inside Clara's chest. Doc Whitman arrived within the hour, his medical bag clutched tight in weathered hands. He examined Benny with unusual nervousness, his fingers trembling as he checked the boy's throat and listened to his labored breathing. "It's diphtheria," he announced grimly, though Clara noticed how quickly he'd made the diagnosis, how he seemed reluctant to look her directly in the eyes. "Highly contagious. The boy needs to be quarantined immediately, and anyone who's been in contact with him should be watched carefully." The word diphtheria spread through Cedar Ridge faster than summer lightning. By evening, Clara's cabin was surrounded by an invisible barrier of fear. Neighbors who had borrowed sugar and shared gossip over the fence now hurried past with their heads down, clutching protective charms and muttering prayers. The general store owner, old Pete Morrison, left their usual order of flour and beans on the front step, rather than allowing Clara inside, and even the postmaster began delivering their mail by leaving it weighted down with rocks at the end of their path. Wednesday brought Reverend Josiah Grimm to their door, his black coat billowing in the mountain wind like the wings of some terrible bird of judgment. His face, already sharp and angular, had grown even more severe since losing his own daughter to fever 3 winters past. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he intoned, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, "the Lord's judgment has fallen upon your house. This sickness is a sign, a warning to our community about the consequences of sin and prideful independence." "My son is 5 years old," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "What sins could a child possibly have committed to deserve this suffering?" But the preacher's eyes held no compassion, only the cold certainty of a man who had convinced himself that tragedy was always deserved, that God's love was as conditional as human charity. The breaking point came on Friday when Judge Thaddeus Blackstone arrived with his leather satchel full of legal documents and his air of officious authority. He was a tall, well-fed man whose expensive clothes marked him as someone from outside their mountain community, someone who measured worth in dollars rather than decency. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he announced, spreading papers across her kitchen table with theatrical precision, "I regret to inform you that your late husband left substantial debts with the Territorial Development Corporation." Clara stared at the documents, her heart sinking as she recognized neither the creditor's name nor the debts listed. The amounts were staggering, more money than Thomas could have earned in 5 years of mining. "This is impossible," she protested. "Thomas never borrowed money from anyone. He paid cash for everything, even our cabin." But Blackstone's smile was as cold as winter moonlight, and his papers bore official seals that looked authentic enough to fool a grieving widow who had never dealt with such matters. "The law is the law, madam," Blackstone replied, his tone suggesting that her protestations were merely the desperate lies of a woman trying to avoid her obligations. "These debts are secured against your property and personal effects. Given your son's unfortunate condition and your inability to maintain employment, the territorial court has authorized a public sale to satisfy these obligations." He paused, letting the full implications sink in before delivering the final blow. "You and the child will be included in the sale, as is customary in cases where the debtor's family cannot provide alternative compensation." The auction was set for the following Monday. Clara had 5 days to find a miracle, or she and Benny would be sold to the highest bidder like livestock at a cattle market. The morning of the auction dawned merciless and bright, with the kind of blazing Colorado sun that seemed to mock human suffering. Clara had spent the sleepless night holding Benny against her chest, feeling each labored breath he took, and wondering if it might be his last. His fever had broken some time before dawn, leaving him weak but conscious, his blue eyes clear enough to understand that something terrible was about to happen to them both. By 10 o'clock, a crowd had gathered in the town square like vultures circling carrion. Clara recognized faces she had once considered friends, farmers whose children she had taught to read, shopkeepers who had welcomed her cheerful morning greetings, women who had shared recipes and gossip over garden fences. Now they watched her with a mixture of morbid curiosity and self-righteous judgment, as if her misfortune validated their own moral superiority. The makeshift auction platform had been hastily constructed from pine boards and sawhorses, elevated just enough to display the merchandise to the assembled crowd. Judge Blackstone stood beside it like a carnival barker, his gold watch chain glinting in the sunlight as he consulted his pocket timepiece with theatrical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out in his booming courtroom voice, "we are gathered here today to conduct a legal sale for the satisfaction of outstanding debts in the matter of the Hawthorne estate." Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame as she was forced to climb the platform steps, Benny's slight weight growing heavier in her arms with each humiliating step. The crowd pressed closer, and she could hear their whispered conversations floating up like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Heard the boys cursed with the diphtheria," muttered one voice. "Shame about her husband, but a woman's got to know her place," added another. "Might be useful for cooking and cleaning if she don't spread the sickness around," came a third observation that made Clara's stomach lurch with revulsion. The bidding began at $25, an amount that seemed to reduce her entire existence to less than the cost of a decent horse. A grizzled prospector named Jake Malloy raised his hand, his intentions clear in the way his eyes lingered on Clara's figure. "30, he called out, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Woman looks strong enough for mining camp work, and the boy won't last long anyway." The casual cruelty of his words hit Clara like a physical blow, and she pulled Benny closer, whispering fierce promises into his ear that she would find a way to protect him no matter what happened. Other bids followed in quick succession, each one feeling like another nail in the coffin of their dignity. $40 from a cattle rancher who needed kitchen help and didn't care about the boy's condition. $45 from a saloon keeper whose establishment catered to lonely miners with money to spend. Each raised hand represented a different kind of hell, and Clara found herself praying to a God who seemed to have abandoned them completely. Martha Rose O'Sullivan, the elderly Irish woman who ran the boarding house, pushed through the crowd with fire in her weathered eyes. At 67, she had buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children in this harsh country, and her voice still carried the authority of someone who had survived more than her share of hardship. "This is an abomination," she declared, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. "In my day, we took care of our own instead of selling them like cattle at market." But her protest was quickly shouted down by other voices in the crowd. "Stay out of it, Martha," called out Pete Morrison from the general store. The law's the law, and that woman brought this on herself somehow. The ugly mood of the crowd was palpable now, fed by fear of disease and the human tendency to blame victims for their own misfortune. Just as Judge Blackstone prepared to bring down his gavel on Jake Malloy's winning bid of $50, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. $100. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried across the square with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The crowd turned as one to see a tall figure on horseback at the edge of the gathering, dust from his journey still clinging to his dark coat and weathered hat. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting both confidence and danger. Clara found herself studying his face as he approached the platform, weathered by sun and wind, with the kind of deep lines around the eyes that came from squinting across vast distances. His dark hair showed streaks of premature silver at the temples, and there was something in his bearing that suggested both Cherokee heritage and frontier hardness. Most striking were his eyes, a pale blue that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. "Sir, I don't believe I know you," Judge Blackstone sputtered, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected development. "This is a legal proceeding, and I'll need to verify your ability to honor such a substantial bid." There was something in the judge's voice that suggested he was less concerned about the money than about maintaining control of the situation. The stranger reached into his vest pocket and produced a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "Samuel Clearwater," he said simply, his voice carrying just a trace of an accent that Clara couldn't quite place. "The money's good, and I'll take responsibility for both the woman and the boy." His gaze found Clara's across the crowded square, and she saw something unexpected there. Not the calculating look of a man making a purchase, but the steady regard of someone making a promise. "Going once?" Judge Blackstone called reluctantly, scanning the crowd for any competing bids. "Going twice." His gavel hung in the air for a long moment, as if he were hoping for some last-minute intervention that would prevent this sale from proceeding. But the square had fallen silent, except for Benny's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Sold to Mr. Clearwater. The ride to Samuel Clearwater's ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the creaking of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the dusty mountain trail. Clara sat rigidly in the wagon seat beside this stranger who had purchased her and Benny like livestock, her arms wrapped protectively around her son as he dozed fitfully against her chest. Every bump in the rough road seemed to jar another cough from the boy's lungs, each one sending a spike of fear through Clara's heart. Samuel guided the horses with practiced ease, his weathered hands steady on the reins despite the obvious fatigue that lined his face. Clara found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to read the intentions of this mysterious man who had appeared like some dark angel at their moment of greatest need. His Cherokee heritage was evident in the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the way he sat his horse with natural grace, but his pale blue eyes spoke of mixed blood and a complicated history she couldn't begin to fathom. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible over the wind through the pine trees. "Why would you pay good money for strangers?" The question had been burning in her throat since the moment his unexpected bid had changed their fate, and she could no longer contain her need to understand his motives. Samuel was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful, like a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel. "I knew your husband, ma'am. Thomas Hawthorne was a good man who deserved better than what this town gave him." The simple statement hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross, filled with implications that Clara wasn't prepared to explore. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, nestled in a valley between two protective ridges of pine-covered hills. It was a modest spread by Colorado standards, A sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a well-built barn, and several corrals where horses grazed in the afternoon sun. Everything spoke of careful maintenance and quiet prosperity, from the neatly stacked woodpile to the kitchen garden where vegetables grew in orderly rows. It was the kind of place Clara had once dreamed of calling home, back when the future had seemed bright with possibility. Samuel helped her down from the wagon with unexpected gentleness, his hands careful not to disturb Benny as she transferred the boy's weight back to her arms. "The cabin's not much," he said quietly, his voice holding an almost apologetic tone, "but it's clean and warm. You and the boy can have the main room. I'll sleep in the barn until we can figure out something more permanent." The interior of the cabin surprised Clara with its cleanliness and organization. The main room held a stone fireplace flanked by built-in shelves lined with books, more books than she had expected a ranch hand to own. A sturdy table occupied the center of the space, surrounded by handcrafted chairs that spoke of skill and patience. The floor was swept clean, and colorful woven rugs added warmth to the practical furnishings. It was a bachelor's dwelling, but one that showed both care and intelligence in its arrangement. "There's a bedroom through that door," Samuel said, nodding toward the back of the cabin. "Bed's got clean linens, and there's a washstand with fresh water. The boy looks like he could use some rest." His observation was both accurate and tactful. Benny's condition had worsened during the journey, his breathing growing more labored with each passing mile. Clara carried her son into the bedroom, a simple space dominated by a large bed covered with a beautiful quilt in shades of blue and green. Sunlight streamed through a single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden air like tiny spirits. As she laid Benny on the soft mattress, he opened his eyes and looked around with the curious wonder that still flickered beneath his illness. "Are we safe now, Mama?" he whispered, his small hand clutching at her worn calico dress. The question broke her heart, because she couldn't give him the absolute assurance he needed, couldn't promise that this sanctuary wouldn't prove to be another kind of trap. "I think so, sweetheart," she replied, smoothing his dark hair away from his fevered forehead. "Mr. Clearwater seems like a kind man, and this is a beautiful place to rest and get better." The words felt strange in her mouth, these tentative expressions of hope after weeks of living with fear and desperation. When she returned to the main room, she found Samuel at the stove, preparing what appeared to be a simple but nourishing meal. The domestic scene felt surreal after the morning's humiliation. This dangerous-looking man moving with surprising grace as he stirred a pot of soup and checked the contents of a Dutch oven. "Thought you both might be hungry," he said without turning around. "It's just rabbit stew and cornbread, but it's filling." They ate in companionable silence, the tension between them easing slightly as basic human needs were met. Clara found herself watching Samuel's hands as he broke bread for Benny, noting the calluses that spoke of hard physical work and the surprising gentleness with which he treated her son. There was something almost familiar about his mannerisms, a way of moving and speaking that reminded her of Thomas, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. As evening approached and Benny fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in weeks, Clara found herself alone with Samuel on the cabin's front porch. The mountain air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of a creek running somewhere beyond the barn. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more brilliant than any she had ever seen during her city upbringing. "You said you knew my husband," she began carefully, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "How? Thomas never mentioned anyone named Clearwater, and I thought I knew all his friends from the mine." The question had been building pressure in her chest all afternoon, and she could no longer contain her curiosity about this man who had saved them from a fate worse than death. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks that stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old pain and carefully guarded secrets. "We served together during the war," he said simply. "Different companies, but we crossed paths at Shiloh and again at Stones River. Thomas saved my life during a Confederate assault, pulled me out of a shell crater when I was too shot up to move." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Thomas had rarely spoken of his war service, and when he did, it was always in vague terms that discouraged further questions. She had known he carried scars, both visible and hidden, from those terrible years, but he had never shared the specific details of his experiences or the bonds he had formed with other soldiers. "He never told me about you," she said, not accusingly, but with genuine puzzlement. "Thomas didn't talk much about the war, but I would have remembered if he'd mentioned saving someone's life." The statement hung between them, creating a new layer of mystery around this man who claimed connection to her late husband. Samuel's smile was sad and understanding. "Thomas was the kind of man who would downplay his own heroism," he replied. "He probably thought of it as just doing his duty, nothing worth bragging about, but it meant everything to me. I had a wife and son waiting for me back in Kansas, and Thomas gave me the chance to see them again." The past tense he used when referring to his family didn't escape Clara's notice, suggesting another story of loss and heartbreak. The conversation was interrupted by a sound from the bedroom, Benny calling out in his sleep, his voice thick with fever dreams. Clara hurried to check on him, finding the boy thrashing weakly under the quilts, his skin burning with renewed fever. The brief improvement they had seen during the journey was clearly temporary, and the harsh reality of his condition came flooding back with crushing force. Samuel appeared in the doorway behind her, his face grave as he took in Benny's deteriorating state. "I've got some willow bark tea that might help with the fever," he offered. "And there's a Ute medicine woman about a day's ride north who knows more about healing than any white doctor I've met. If you're willing, I could take the boy to her tomorrow." The suggestion surprised Clara. Most white men in the territory viewed Indian medicine with suspicion or outright hostility. That Samuel would suggest consulting a Ute healer spoke to an open-mindedness that was rare in frontier communities. "You really think she could help?" Clara asked, hope warring with skepticism in her voice. Doc Whitman's treatments had failed so completely that she was willing to try almost anything. "Medicine Crow has cured ailments that white doctors gave up on," Samuel replied with quiet conviction. "She saved my horse from a rattlesnake bite that should have killed him, and I've seen her work miracles with sick children. It's worth a try, especially if the alternative is—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood what he meant. As the night deepened and Benny's condition stabilized temporarily, Clara found herself studying this mysterious man who had become their unlikely savior. There were layers to Samuel Clearwater that she was only beginning to perceive. The gentle way he handled her son, the books that lined his shelves, the obvious prosperity of his ranch despite his claim to be a simple cowhand. Most intriguing was the sadness that seemed to shadow his pale blue eyes, suggesting depths of experience and loss that she was only beginning to understand. "Why are you really helping us?" she asked again, this time with more directness. "Don't tell me it's just because you knew Thomas. Men don't spend $100 on strangers out of simple gratitude, especially not for a sick child and a woman with no prospects." The question was blunt, but Clara had learned the hard way that survival sometimes required abandoning the polite conventions of civilized society. Samuel turned to look at her, and in the lamplight she could see something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "Because I couldn't save my own family," he said quietly, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "My wife Emma and my boy died of cholera 3 years ago, and I was too far away to even hold their hands when they passed. Maybe I can't bring them back, but I can try to keep history from repeating itself with you and Benny." The confession hung between them like a bridge of shared sorrow, connecting two people who had both lost everything and found themselves starting over in the unforgiving wilderness of the American West. Clara felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill down her cheeks, not just for her own situation, but for this wounded man who was trying to heal his own grief by healing theirs. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know. The pain must be unbearable." She understood now the source of the sadness she had glimpsed in his eyes, the careful way he handled Benny, the desperate edge beneath his calm exterior. "It gets easier some days," Samuel replied, his voice barely audible in the quiet night. "Other days, it feels like the wound's still bleeding. But having you and the boy here, it gives me something to fight for again, something worth protecting." The admission was clearly difficult for him, this man who seemed more comfortable with action than words. As they sat together in the peaceful silence of the mountain night, both lost in their own thoughts and memories, neither noticed the figure watching them from the shadows beyond the barn. Someone had followed them from town, someone with an interest in ensuring that Clara May Hawthorne's story ended in tragedy rather than redemption. The journey to Medicine Crow's camp began before dawn, with Samuel loading supplies into his wagon, while Clara wrapped Benny in every blanket they could spare. The boy's condition had worsened overnight, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin burning with fever that no amount of willow bark tea could touch. Clara held him close as they traveled the narrow mountain trails, whispering prayers and promises into his sweat-dampened hair, while trying to ignore the growing certainty that time was running out. Medicine Crow's village sat in a hidden valley where hot springs bubbled up from the earth, creating pools of steaming water that the Ute people had used for healing ceremonies for countless generations. The elderly woman who emerged from the largest teepee was small and weathered, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence and something deeper that Clara couldn't quite name. She examined Benny without speaking, her gnarled hands gentle as she checked his breathing and felt the heat radiating from his small body. "This is not the sickness you think," Medicine Crow finally said, her English accented but clear. "The spirits whisper of poison, not disease. Someone has put bad medicine in your water, child. The boy's body fights not sickness from the air, but poison from the earth." Her words hit Clara like a physical blow, challenging everything Doc Whitman had told them about diphtheria and contagion. The healing ceremony that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed. Medicine Crow prepared a series of herbal baths using plants that she gathered from the mountainside, each one designed to draw the toxins from Benny's system. The process was slow and sometimes frightening. The boy's fever spiked dangerously high before it finally broke, leaving him weak but breathing more easily than he had in weeks. During the 3 days they spent at the Ute camp, Clara found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her husband's death and her son's illness. If Medicine Crow was right about poison in the water, then someone had deliberately contaminated their well. The implications were staggering. Thomas might not have died in a mining accident, and Benny's suffering might not be the result of random misfortune. Samuel seemed to be wrestling with similar thoughts, his face growing darker and more troubled as Benny slowly began to recover. On their final evening at the camp, he pulled Clara aside for a conversation that would change everything she thought she understood about their situation. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he began, his voice heavy with guilt and something that might have been fear. The confession that followed shattered Clara's fragile sense of security. Samuel Clearwater wasn't just a retired soldier trying to make a living as a rancher. He was a wanted man, hunted by federal marshals for killing a corrupt sheriff in Kansas. The sheriff had been taking bribes from railroad companies to look the other way while they poisoned water sources and seized land from homesteaders. Samuel's wife and son had been among the victims, and when the law refused to act, Samuel had taken justice into his own hands. "I came to Colorado to disappear," he explained, his pale blue eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Changed my name, bought the ranch with cash, tried to forget about Emma and little Jake. But when I heard what was happening to you and Benny, I couldn't turn away. The pattern was too familiar. The mysterious illness, the convenient debts, the forced sale of property. Someone's using the same playbook they used in Kansas." Clara felt the world spinning around her as the implications sank in. "You think Thomas discovered something?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You think they killed him to keep him quiet, then tried to get rid of Benny and me because we might know something dangerous?" The pieces were falling into place now. Thomas's strange behavior in the weeks before his death, his secretive trips to different parts of the mountain, the way he had started talking about moving back east. Samuel nodded grimly. "I think your husband found evidence of water contamination, probably connected to the new railroad spur they're planning to build through this valley. The mining company and the railroad are working together. They poison the water to make people sick, then spread panic about contagious disease to force quick property sales. Once they've cleared out the homesteaders, they can build wherever they want without legal challenges." The revelation transformed everything Clara thought she understood about their situation. They weren't victims of random misfortune or divine judgment. They were targets in a conspiracy that reached from the territorial capital to the corporate boardrooms back east. Judge Blackstone wasn't just collecting legitimate debts. He was part of a criminal organization that murdered anyone who threatened their profits. As they prepared to leave Medicine Crow's camp, the elderly woman pressed a small leather pouch into Clara's hands. "Protection medicine," she explained. "The poison makers will not stop with your family. They will come for others, and you will need to be strong to fight them. The spirits say you have the courage of a mother bear. Use it to protect all the children, not just your own." The journey back to Samuel's ranch was marked by a new understanding between them. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were allies bound by shared loss and a common enemy. Clara found herself studying Samuel's profile as he guided the horses through the mountain passes, noting the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of the railroad conspiracy and the haunted look that crossed his features whenever he mentioned his dead family. Benny's recovery continued steadily as they traveled, the boy's natural resilience asserting itself now that the poison was being purged from his system. He began asking questions about the pretty lady who had made him feel better, about the funny-tasting medicine that had made his breathing easier, about why his mama looked so serious all the time now. Clara struggled to find age-appropriate explanations for the adult horrors they were facing, settling for vague reassurances that everything would be all right. But everything was far from all right. When they crested the final ridge before Samuel's ranch, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the cabin. Not the friendly smoke of a cooking fire, but the thick black smoke of destruction. Samuel urged the horses to greater speed, his face grim with the certainty that their enemies had found them. The ranch was in ruins. The barn had been completely destroyed, the cabin's roof partially collapsed, and the carefully tended garden trampled beyond recognition. Samuel's horses lay dead in the corral, their bodies already drawing flies in the summer heat. Painted on the side of what remained of the cabin, in letters 3 feet high, was a single word that made Clara's blood run cold. Wanted. Samuel stood amid the destruction of everything he had built, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "They found me," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of rage and resignation. "The federal marshals must have traced me here, or someone in town recognized me from a wanted poster. Either way, we can't stay. They'll be back with more men, and next time they won't just burn buildings. Clara felt a surge of panic at the thought of running again, of leaving the only place where Benny had started to feel safe. But she could see the truth in Samuel's assessment. They were all in danger now, not just from the railroad conspiracy, but from the law itself. Samuel's past had caught up with them, and association with a wanted killer would destroy any chance she might have had of finding legitimate help for her situation. "There's something else," Samuel continued, his voice growing even grimmer. He led her to what remained of his cabin's main room, where the floorboards had been torn up and the furniture smashed with methodical thoroughness. "They weren't just looking for me, they were searching for something specific. See how they went through everything systematically? This wasn't random destruction or even a marshal's search. Someone told them I had evidence." The implications were chilling. If Samuel was right, then their enemies knew about the connection between his past and their current situation. The railroad conspiracy wasn't just targeting individual families. They were part of a larger criminal network with resources that stretched across multiple territories. Clara and Benny had become pawns in a game far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As they stood amid the smoking ruins of their temporary sanctuary, Clara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and determination. "We don't run," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We fight. They killed your family, they killed my husband, and they tried to kill my son. If we keep running, they'll just keep hunting us, and other families will suffer the same way." Samuel looked at her with something approaching admiration. "You understand what that means," he said. "Fighting them means going up against federal marshals, railroad money, and territorial judges. It means risking everything on the chance that we can expose their crimes before they eliminate us as witnesses." Clara thought of Benny, sleeping peacefully in the wagon for the first time in weeks, his fever finally broken and his breathing clear. She thought of Thomas, dying alone in a collapsed mine tunnel because he had tried to do the right thing. She thought of Samuel's wife Emma and their son Jake, victims of the same greed and corruption that had nearly claimed her own family. "Then that's what we do," she said firmly. "We find the evidence Thomas died for, and we make sure the whole territory knows what these people have done. No more children should have to suffer because evil men put profit above human life." The tragedy struck with the swiftness of a mountain avalanche, destroying everything Clara had dared to hope for in the span of a single horrific day. They had returned to Cedar Ridge under cover of darkness, seeking shelter with Martha Rose O'Sullivan while they planned their next move. The elderly Irish woman had welcomed them without question, her boarding house becoming a sanctuary where they could regroup and gather the evidence needed to expose the railroad conspiracy. For 3 precious days it seemed as though their luck might finally be turning. Benny continued to recover under Martha Rose's doting care, his laughter returning as Medicine Crow's treatments purged the last of the poison from his small body. Samuel worked tirelessly to piece together the scope of the conspiracy, using his knowledge of railroad operations and Martha Rose's surprising network of contacts throughout the territory. Clara threw herself into searching through Thomas's belongings, looking for the evidence she now believed he had hidden before his death. The breakthrough came when Clara discovered a loose floorboard in their old cabin's bedroom, beneath which Thomas had concealed a leather portfolio filled with water samples, survey maps, and correspondence that painted a damning picture of corporate malfeasance. The documents revealed a systematic campaign to contaminate water sources throughout the Colorado Territory, creating health crises that forced desperate families to sell their land at below-market prices. The railroad and mining companies would then swoop in to purchase the properties, building their infrastructure over the graves of the communities they had destroyed. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. As Clara, Samuel, and Martha Rose celebrated their discovery in the boarding house kitchen, Sheriff Dalton Cross burst through the door with a posse of armed men behind him. Clara's heart sank as she recognized several faces in the group. Men she had once considered neighbors and friends, now turned against them by fear and misinformation. "Samuel Clearwater," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sheriff William Morrison in Kansas and for conspiracy to spread disease in this territory." The charges were absurd, but Clara could see from the faces of the posse members that they believed every word. The propaganda campaign against them had been thorough and effective. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Samuel reached for his gun, not to fight but to protect Clara and Benny from the mob that was forming outside the boarding house. But Sheriff Cross was faster, his pistol already drawn and aimed at Samuel's chest. The shot that rang out across the quiet mountain town seemed to echo forever, followed by the terrible sound of Samuel's body hitting the floor. Clara's scream of anguish was lost in the chaos that followed. Martha Rose threw herself over Benny's small form, shielding him from the violence, while Clara dropped to her knees beside Samuel's bleeding body. His pale blue eyes found hers in the lamplight, already growing dim with approaching death. "The evidence," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the shouting of the posse. "Don't let them destroy the truth." Those were Samuel Clearwater's last words, the man who had saved Clara and Benny from the auction block, who had shown them kindness when the world had turned its back, who had risked everything to help them find justice for their murdered loved ones, died on Martha Rose's kitchen floor with Clara's tears falling on his face. But the nightmare was far from over. As Clara cradled Samuel's lifeless body, she became aware of new voices joining the commotion outside. Judge Thaddeus Blackstone had arrived with federal marshals, armed with warrants that declared Martha Rose's boarding house a nest of criminals and conspirators. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he announced with cold satisfaction, "you are hereby charged with harboring a known fugitive and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." The irony was bitter and complete. Clara, who had spent weeks seeking justice for her family, now found herself branded as a criminal by the very system she had hoped would protect her. The evidence Thomas had died to preserve was confiscated as terrorist materials, and the testimony of Medicine Crow was dismissed as savage superstition, unworthy of consideration by civilized courts. Martha Rose fought like a wildcat to protect Clara and Benny, her Irish temper flaring as she confronted the corrupt officials with a stream of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. But even her fierce loyalty couldn't stand against the combined might of railroad money and territorial authority. The marshals dragged her away in chains, leaving Clara and Benny alone and defenseless in a hostile world. The final blow came when Doc Ezra Whitman appeared with a court order declaring Benny unfit for normal society due to his diseased condition. Despite Medicine Crow's successful treatment, despite the boy's obvious recovery, the doctor insisted that the child posed a continuing threat to public health. Benny would be taken to a territorial sanitarium where he could be properly isolated until his death. A death that Doc Whitman seemed confident would come sooner rather than later. As rough hands seized her son and carried him toward a waiting wagon, Clara felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Benny's terrified cries for his mama echoed across the town square where just weeks earlier she had stood on the auction block believing that her degradation was complete. Now she understood that there were depths of suffering she had never imagined, levels of cruelty that even her worst nightmares hadn't prepared her for. The townspeople who had once called her friend now watched her collapse with the same morbid fascination they had shown at the auction. Some seemed genuinely troubled by what they were witnessing, but fear kept them silent. Others nodded with righteous satisfaction, convinced that justice was finally being served to a woman who had brought disease and violence to their peaceful community. Clara was left alone on the dusty street, stripped of everything she had ever loved, surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of former neighbors. Samuel was dead. Benny was condemned to die in isolation. Martha Rose was imprisoned, and the evidence that might have saved them all had been destroyed by the very officials sworn to uphold justice. As darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, Clara May Hawthorne understood that she had reached the absolute bottom of human experience. There was nothing left to lose, nothing left to hope for, nothing left but the burning desire for revenge against those who had taken everything from her. The revelation came in the form of a dying man's confession, delivered by someone Clara had never expected to find, lurking in the shadows behind Cedar Ridge's church at midnight. Doc Ezra Whitman emerged from the darkness like a specter, his usually neat appearance disheveled and his hands shaking with what Clara initially mistook for drunkenness, but soon recognized as the tremors of a man consumed by guilt. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he whispered, his voice cracked and desperate, "I can't carry this burden any longer. What they made me do to your boy, to all those children, it's eating me alive from the inside." The doctor's confession poured out in a torrent of self-recrimination and terror, revealing a conspiracy far more twisted and evil than Clara had ever imagined. The truth was horrifying in its simplicity and scope. There was no diphtheria epidemic, no random outbreak of disease that had cursed their community. Doc Whitman had been systematically poisoning the children of Cedar Ridge with arsenic compounds, creating the symptoms of various diseases while ensuring that his treatments would fail. The railroad company had promised him a fortune for his cooperation, but more importantly, they had threatened to harm his own grandchildren if he refused to participate in their scheme. "I never meant for it to go this far," Whitman sobbed, his weathered hands clutching at Clara's dress like a drowning man grasping for salvation. "They said it would just be a few families, just enough to create panic and drive down property values. But then more children got sick than we expected, and some of them died because I gave them the wrong medicine on purpose." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Doc Whitman, the man who had delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge, who had tended their fevers and set their broken bones, who had been trusted with the most precious lives in the community, had been systematically murdering children for money. Clara felt bile rise in her throat as she realized that Benny's suffering, Samuel's death, and her own destruction had all been orchestrated by this monster who wore the face of a healer. "Judge Blackstone isn't the mastermind," Whitman continued, his confession tumbling out faster as his courage built. "He's just another victim, being blackmailed because his own son was one of the children I poisoned. The real power behind this conspiracy is Harrison Blackwood, the railroad executive from Denver. He's been orchestrating these land grabs across 3 territories, and he's got federal judges and marshals on his payroll." Clara's mind reeled as the true dimensions of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about Cedar Ridge or even Colorado territory. It was a systematic campaign of murder and theft that stretched across the American West, leaving devastated communities in its wake. Families like hers were just collateral damage in a corporate war where human life meant nothing compared to profit margins and railroad routes. "Where is my son?" Clara demanded, her voice steady despite the rage boiling in her chest. "Where have they really taken Benny?" The question cut through Whitman's self-pity like a blade, focusing his attention on the one thing that mattered most to her. The doctor's answer nearly drove her to her knees. "There is no sanitarium," he admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "They took the boy to an abandoned mining camp in the mountains, 20 miles north of here. Blackwood wants to use him as leverage to keep you quiet, but if that fails—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood the implication. Her 5-year-old son was being held prisoner by monsters who wouldn't hesitate to murder a child to protect their secrets. "There's more," Whitman continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Samuel Clearwater was right about everything. Your husband Thomas found evidence of the water contamination and was preparing to expose the whole conspiracy. They murdered him in that mine collapse. It wasn't an accident. And the evidence he gathered is still hidden somewhere. If you can find it, you might be able to bring them all down." Clara felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, replacing the grief and despair that had consumed her since Samuel's death. These people had killed her husband, tortured her son, murdered Samuel, and destroyed the lives of countless innocent families. They had used the very institutions meant to protect society, the law, medicine, religion, as weapons against the helpless and defenseless. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had left her alive. The next revelation came from an unexpected source. Martha Rose O'Sullivan appeared out of the darkness behind the church, moving with surprising stealth for a woman her age. Clara's heart leaped with joy at seeing her friend apparently free, but the elderly woman's first words dashed any hope of simple rescue. "I broke out of that jail cell because I have something to tell you, child," Martha Rose said, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "I haven't been entirely honest about who I am or why I came to Cedar Ridge." The confession that followed added another layer of complexity to their desperate situation. Martha Rose revealed that she wasn't just a retired boarding house operator. She was a former Pinkerton detective who had been investigating the railroad conspiracy for over a year. Her superiors at the agency had suspected that Harrison Blackwood was behind a series of suspicious land acquisitions, but they needed evidence that would stand up in federal court. Martha Rose had been placed in Cedar Ridge as an undercover operative, tasked with gathering that evidence. "I've been documenting everything," she explained, producing a thick portfolio from beneath her shawl. Photographs of the contaminated water sources, copies of forged legal documents, testimony from families in other territories who suffered the same fate as yours. "I've got enough evidence to hang the whole lot of them, but I need to get it to my contacts in Denver before Blackwood's people realize what I've been doing." Clara stared at this revelation in amazement. The elderly woman she had seen as a simple kindred spirit was actually a professional investigator with the resources and connections needed to bring down the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. But even as hope began to flutter in her chest, Martha Rose delivered another devastating blow. "There's a problem," the former detective admitted. "My cover's been blown. Someone in the Pinkerton organization is feeding information to Blackwood, and they know I'm here. Federal marshals are already on their way to arrest me as a co-conspirator, using the same playbook they used against you and Samuel. We have maybe 6 hours before this town is crawling with corrupt lawmen who'll kill us all to keep their secrets safe." The ticking clock that had been haunting Clara's nightmares suddenly became very real and very immediate. 6 hours to rescue Benny from his mountain prison, expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, and escape the net of corrupt law enforcement that was closing around them. It seemed impossible, but Clara had learned that impossible was just another word for difficult when a mother's love was the driving force. "Then we better get started," Clara said, her voice carrying a strength and determination that surprised everyone present, including herself. The broken woman who had collapsed in the street after losing everything was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous than any of them had expected. As the three conspirators began planning their desperate gambit against overwhelming odds, none of them noticed the figure watching from the church bell tower above. Someone had been listening to their conversation, someone who would soon be carrying word of their plans to the very people they were trying to destroy. The trap was closing even faster than they realized, and the final confrontation was rushing toward them like an avalanche thundering down a mountainside. The truth had been revealed, but truth alone wouldn't be enough to save them. They would need courage, luck, and perhaps a miracle to survive the next 6 hours and rescue the innocent child who had become the focal point of a conspiracy that reached from the Colorado mountains to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. The rescue of Benjamin Hawthorne began in the pre-dawn darkness of a Colorado morning that would be remembered in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Clara, Martha Rose, and Doc Whitman rode hard through mountain trails that were little more than deer paths, following the guilt-stricken physician's directions to the abandoned mining camp where her son was being held prisoner. Behind them, the first light of sunrise painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise either salvation or apocalypse. The mining camp sat in a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by towering pines, its cluster of ramshackle buildings looking like broken teeth against the morning sky. Smoke rose from only one chimney, suggesting that most of the structures were empty. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she spotted two guards lounging outside what appeared to be the main bunkhouse, their rifles propped casually against the porch railing as they shared a bottle of whiskey despite the early hour. Martha Rose's years of detective work proved invaluable as they planned their approach. She had brought climbing rope and a small arsenal of weapons from her hidden cache, transforming the desperate rescue attempt into a precision operation. Doc Whitman's intimate knowledge of the camp's layout, gained during previous visits to deliver his poisonous medicines, allowed them to identify the building where Benny was most likely being held. The assault began with Martha Rose creating a diversion on the far side of the camp, using firecrackers and shouting to draw the guards away from their posts. Clara and Doc Whitman used the distraction to slip into the suspected prison building, where they found Benny locked in a root cellar that had been converted into a makeshift jail cell. The sight of her son, pale and frightened but alive, nearly brought Clara to her knees with relief. "Mama," Benny whispered, as she gathered him into her arms, his small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "I knew you'd come for me. The bad men said you were dead, but I didn't believe them." His faith in her, maintained even in the darkest circumstances, gave Clara strength she didn't know she possessed. But their moment of reunion was cut short by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and shouting voices. Harrison Blackwood had arrived with a company of hired gunmen, having anticipated that someone might attempt to rescue the boy. The trap they had walked into was about to snap shut with deadly force. The battle that followed was brief, but fierce. Martha Rose proved that her years hadn't dulled her fighting skills, picking off two gunmen with precise rifle shots from her concealed position in the tree line. Doc Whitman, driven by guilt and desperate to atone for his crimes, threw himself between Clara and an armed thug, taking a bullet in the chest that was meant for her. As he lay dying in the dirt, he pressed a key into Clara's hand and gasped out his final words. "Thomas's evidence, hidden in the church bell tower. This key opens the box." Clara found herself in a running gunfight through the mountain forest, carrying Benny while Martha Rose provided covering fire from multiple positions. The elderly detective's tactical skills and Clara's desperate maternal instincts proved to be a formidable combination against Blackwood's mercenaries, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. The situation seemed hopeless until an unexpected ally arrived to tip the balance. A company of genuine federal marshals, led by Martha Rose's contact from the Pinkerton agency, came thundering into the valley just as Blackwood was closing in for the kill. The corrupt railroad executive found himself caught between two forces: Clara's small but determined group on one side and legitimate federal law enforcement on the other. His hired guns, realizing they were facing real marshals rather than defenseless civilians, quickly decided that their pay wasn't worth dying for a lost cause. The confrontation with Harrison Blackwood himself was personal and savage. This was the man whose greed had destroyed Clara's family, whose conspiracy had murdered her husband and nearly killed her son. When she faced him across the abandoned mining camp with a rifle in her hands and justice burning in her heart, Clara felt the full weight of everything she had lost and everything she was fighting to protect. "You killed my husband," she said, her voice steady despite the rage coursing through her veins. "You tortured my son. You murdered Samuel Clearwater and God knows how many other innocent people, all for money and railroad routes." The accounting of his crimes seemed to go on forever, each accusation hitting Blackwood like a physical blow. But Harrison Blackwood was a man who had built his fortune on the suffering of others, and he wasn't prepared to face justice without a fight. His response was to grab Benny as a human shield, pressing a gun to the terrified child's head while demanding safe passage out of the territory. The sight of her son in mortal danger nearly broke Clara's resolve, but Martha Rose's steady voice in her ear reminded her of what needed to be done. "He's a dead man either way," the former detective whispered. "If you let him go, he'll kill the boy to eliminate the witness. If you take the shot, you might save Benny and end this nightmare forever." The weight of the decision, her son's life balanced against the certainty that Blackwood would never stop killing, nearly crushed Clara beneath its enormity. The shot that ended Harrison Blackwood's reign of terror came not from Clara's rifle, but from an unexpected source. Judge Thaddeus Blackstone, the man everyone had believed to be part of the conspiracy, appeared from behind a collapsed mine building with a smoking pistol in his weathered hands. His own son's death from Whitman's poison had driven him to a reckoning that transcended his fear of Blackwood's threats. "No more children die because of this bastard," Blackstone said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a father's grief and a judge's authority. "No more families destroyed. No more innocent blood on my hands." The corrupt system that had seemed so powerful and untouchable crumbled in that moment, brought down by the simple act of one man choosing justice over self-preservation. As the dust settled and the genuine federal marshals took custody of the surviving conspirators, Clara held Benny close and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The evidence Thomas had died to preserve was retrieved from its hiding place in the church bell tower, providing prosecutors with everything they needed to dismantle the entire criminal network. Martha Rose's Pinkerton files filled in the remaining gaps, ensuring that justice would reach every corner of the conspiracy. The truth had finally been revealed, the guilty had been punished, and the innocent had been vindicated. But the cost had been terrible. Thomas, Samuel, Doc Whitman, and dozens of children across 3 territories had paid with their lives for Harrison Blackwood's greed. As Clara looked into her son's eyes and saw the resilience that had carried him through his ordeal, she knew that their fight for justice had been worth every sacrifice. 3 months after the final confrontation in the mountain valley, Cedar Ridge had transformed into something its residents barely recognized. The arrival of federal investigators and legitimate journalists had exposed not just the railroad conspiracy, but the complicity of an entire community that had allowed fear to override compassion. The reckoning that followed was both necessary and painful, forcing every citizen to examine their role in the tragedy that had nearly destroyed an innocent family. Clara May Hawthorne stood in the doorway of the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, watching her son play with the other children in the afternoon sunshine. Benny had recovered completely from his ordeal, his laughter once again filling the mountain air as he chased his friends across the playground that had been constructed where the old auction platform once stood. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Where once the community had gathered to sell human beings like livestock, now children played freely under the protective watch of adults who had learned the true meaning of civilization. The town's transformation had been as dramatic as it was overdue. New leadership had emerged from the ashes of the old corrupt system, with Judge Blackstone serving as interim mayor while legitimate officials were elected. Martha Rose O'Sullivan had been appointed as the new sheriff, her Pinkerton experience and unshakable moral compass making her the natural choice to restore law and order to a community that had lost both. Doc Ezra Whitman's former practice had been taken over by a young physician from Denver who actually believed in healing rather than harming his patients. Perhaps most importantly, the water system had been completely rebuilt with federal oversight, ensuring that no family would ever again suffer the kind of systematic poisoning that had made Benny sick and driven Thomas Hawthorne to his death. A memorial fountain now bubbled with clean, clear water in the center of town square, bearing the names of all those who had died because of the conspiracy. Samuel Clearwater's name was engraved at the top, honoring the man who had sacrificed everything to save a widow and her child. Clara had been offered the position of head teacher at the Territorial Education Office in Denver, a prestigious post that would have provided financial security and recognition for her role in exposing the conspiracy. But she had chosen to remain in Cedar Ridge, understanding that the community's healing required forgiveness as well as justice. The people who had once turned their backs on her family now looked to her for guidance and redemption, and she had found within herself the grace to provide both. The new schoolhouse where she taught was named the Thomas Hawthorne Memorial School, honoring her late husband's sacrifice in exposing the truth that had ultimately saved so many lives. Students came not just from Cedar Ridge, but from surrounding communities, their parents trusting Clara with their most precious possessions because they knew she understood the sacred responsibility of protecting children from the greed and corruption of adults. Benny had become something of a local celebrity, his survival story inspiring other families who had suffered similar tragedies. He seemed largely untraumatized by his ordeal, possessing the remarkable resilience of childhood that allowed him to remember the adventure more than the terror. He often spoke of his friend Mr. Samuel, keeping alive the memory of the man who had saved them both through stories that grew more heroic with each telling. Martha Rose had become a surrogate grandmother to Benny, her boarding house serving as an unofficial community center where people gathered to share news and support one another through the difficult process of rebuilding trust. Her evening storytelling sessions, where she regaled children with tales of her detective adventures, had become a beloved tradition that drew families from across the territory. The railroad company that had orchestrated so much suffering had been dissolved by federal order, its assets sold to pay compensation to the families of victims. Clara had used her settlement money to establish a fund for families facing medical crises, ensuring that no parent would ever again have to choose between their child's health and their family's survival. The fund was administered by a board that included representatives from all the affected communities, creating a network of mutual support that stretched across territorial boundaries. The legal proceedings had continued for months, with trials in Denver and Washington, D.C. that exposed the full scope of the conspiracy to a shocked nation. Clara had testified before Congress about the systematic murder of children for corporate profit, her words helping to pass new federal legislation protecting homesteaders from fraudulent land seizures. Her testimony had been reprinted in newspapers across the country, making her a national symbol of maternal courage in the face of overwhelming corruption. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in the relationships within Cedar Ridge itself. Families who had once avoided the Hawthornes now competed to help with Benny's care when Clara was working. Children who had been forbidden to play with the diseased boy now treated him as their leader and protector. The community that had once been divided by fear and prejudice had been united by shared shame and the common goal of redemption. As autumn approached and the aspen leaves began their annual transformation from green to gold, Clara found herself thinking often of Samuel Clearwater and the brief time they had shared. She knew now that their connection had been deeper than mere gratitude or even romantic attraction. They had been two wounded souls finding healing in each other's company, two people who understood that love sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice. His memory lived on, not just in her heart, but in the better world they had fought together to create. The evening ritual had become sacred to both mother and son. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Clara and Benny would walk to Samuel's grave in the new cemetery that had been established on the hill overlooking town. They would place fresh wildflowers on the simple wooden cross that marked his resting place and tell him about their day, about the children Clara was teaching, and the adventures Benny was having. It was their way of keeping his spirit alive, of ensuring that his sacrifice continued to inspire them toward kindness and courage. Standing beside that grave as another day ended, Clara felt the profound gratitude that had become the defining emotion of her new life. They had lost so much, Thomas, Samuel, their innocence about human nature, but they had gained something precious in return. They had learned that love was stronger than fear, that truth was more powerful than corruption, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from destroying one's enemies, but from transforming them into friends. Do you remember a time when your community came together to protect someone vulnerable? And what lessons did that experience teach you about the power of collective compassion? Have you ever witnessed how ordinary people can find extraordinary courage when defending what they believe is right? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might inspire others to choose love over fear when facing their own challenges.